So light, slow, deep breathing is a very basic technique that will help to be able to increase the amount of CO2 or carbon dioxide that has been associated with that bronchodilation we've been talking about by increasing nitric oxide that's associated with that nervous system shift. Because we do increase heart rate variability, and heart rate variability increases a sign of that nervous system shifting into that relaxed state, that state of safety.
Welcome to the Soaring Child podcast, where parents of children with ADHD learn tips and tricks to help their child soar at home, at school, and in life. We feature interviews with experts, medical professionals, and parents just like you who are learning how to reduce ADHD symptoms using food and other natural strategies. Because children with ADHD deserve to soar just like every other child. I'm Dana Kay, your host. Hello, parents. This is Dana Kay here with another edition of the Soaring Child podcast. So a few years ago, well, actually, maybe more like 10 years ago now, I literally just can't believe it. My son Oliver was often really restless at nighttime, and he really struggled to settle down and to sleep. And I know, like many of you parents listening today, many of your children probably have the same issue. You know, the challenge wasn't just sort of that physical restlessness, but for him, it was his mind that just raced with that endless energy, and it really made his nights difficult, and it made our mornings even harder. And we tried various strategies, but it was a simple free technique that we learned that really finally started to make a difference. It didn't just sort of help him sleep better. It helped him focus better. It helped him at school and be more calmer. And so it also transformed our evenings and our mornings. So you're probably wondering to yourself, okay, well, what is this simple free technique? And I want to share that it is actually a special type of breathing. Now, look, we've explored general breath work before on the podcast, and I have to say that the responses were overwhelmingly positive, and many of you actually reached out to share that even small changes in breathing brought that calm and brought that focus into your child's life. So I was really inspired by that. And I wanted to go deeper. I wanted to turn our attention to a specific type of breath work known as Buteyko breathing. And given the profound impact that proper breathing had on my family, I am particularly excited to welcome back a very special guest, Dr. Miles Nichols. And Dr. Nichols is not only a functional medicine expert. You would have heard him on our podcast before. He has deep insights into conditions like Lyme and mold illness and gut health and autoimmunity, but he's also someone who has battled and overcome significant health challenges through these integrative approaches. He is the founder of the Medicine with Heart Clinic in Colorado and the Medicine with Heart Institute, where he actually trains other doctors in functional medicine. So today, Dr. Nichols will share with us the science behind Buteyko breathing. He's actually going to debunk some common myths around it, and he's going to guide us through a simple practice that you guys can start with your children tonight. So if you're looking for that natural method to really enhance the focus, improve sleep, and bring some more calm to your life, then this episode is for you. So now it's time to welcome back Dr. Miles to the Soaring Child. Hi, Dr. Miles. How are you?
Hi, Dana. I'm wonderful today. So happy to be here, especially talking about this topic, which is close to my heart for a number of reasons that I'm sure we'll get into some of. And I really feel like this is invaluable information that I want to be out there. And thank you for helping to spread this.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for spreading it as well, because it is invaluable information, and we don't put enough weight on breathing. It just happens as a part of our daily life, but it is crucial to so many different functions in our body and to keep us alive. So can you just sort of dive in and explain sort of that foundational science behind the Buteyko breathing?
Yeah. And one way that I want to explain that is first to say that I have a personal history with asthma and eczema analogies and lots of other things, but asthma, I've been in a position where I've been struggling to breathe, struggling to get enough air, feeling that wheeze, feeling that constriction in the airways. And the response that I've had in those times that I think is natural and most people have is to try to breathe deeper and faster, try to get more air in. And when we look at breath practices in general, and when people think about breathing, there's some things that have started to create this sense that, oh, deep breathing is a good idea. I'm not going to tell you that deep breathing isn't a good idea, but I am going to tell you that the respiratory rate and the volume of air that is taken into and out of the lungs every minute may be too much for many people. And lessening that rate may be helpful. And that's especially true in asthmatics. And I really wish that I had known when literally, I remember being, so I have a cat allergy also, and that really exacerbated my asthma and made it really bad as a kid. And I was staying at someone's house who had a cat, and it got so bad that I couldn't keep laying down. I had to go outside, and I was trying to get fresh air, and I was trying to breathe, and just sitting there and wondering, should I go to the hospital? What should happen? And even once I was actually traveling, I was overseas. I was in Egypt with my sister, and we were staying at a friend of hers house there. And it did get so bad that I did go to the hospital, in Egypt, and it was not a fun experience. It was not what I wanted to do there. And to feel that I want more air and I'm trying and I'm not getting it. I really wish that I had these tools back then, because we know now, and there's data and there's peer-reviewed clinical trials that we can really improve asthma, and we can be comparable to things like asthma medications, especially rescue inhalers, and we've seen people coming off of asthma medications, and we've seen people being able to handle acute episodes. I'm not saying replace your inhaler, replace medication. I'm saying we've seen, guided by a medical provider, we've seen this time and time again where we see dramatic improvements. And if I knew back then that CO2 was so important to bronchodilation, if I had known back then that I could simply hold my breath and breathe less and have my bronchodilation improve, and I could actually start to get air again during that acute episode, I may not have had to go to the hospital in Egypt. I may not have had to be alone outside, scared, trying to be able to get air. And so
it's very scary. I couldn't even imagine, especially, being away from home. And, you probably, it sounds like you were a little bit older at that time, but, as a child, and that other story that you shared, that would have been very, very scary for you. I actually also suffered from asthma when I was a child. I was on inhalers. I had all the asthma medications, and, it just takes me back to that feeling as well of not being able to breathe and just needing that something. So this is really fascinating. As Dr. Miles said, definitely don't take this as medical advice to stop your inhalers. You should always work with a qualified doctor on this, because asthma can be deadly. But continue with this fascinating conversation, because I just, my mind is blown right now.
yeah, and the weird thing about it is that what the research shows is that carbon dioxide does act as a vehicle to produce nitric oxide in the sinuses. And nitric oxide is one of the things that the lungs use to bronchodilate. So nitrosoglutathione, so glutathione and nitric oxide combined together in the lungs as part of the lungs method for bronchodilation. With asthma, we have a lot of bronchoconstriction. We also have inflammation. We have sometimes some mucus production as well. We know nitric oxide and CO2 increases in the brain can also thin mucus. So we have multiple mechanisms. We have mucus thinning and we have bronchodilation that are able to improve not only an acute asthmatic situation, but lung function, and that are able to change the way in which the lungs, the capacity for the lungs to bronchodilate on the daily. So that really can be used best is preventively, but also acutely in these kinds of situations. And if I had known that, and I had known that what I could do is I could actually breathe less, which was the last thing I wanted to or thought of doing in that moment.
Totally.
But I could implement a specific technique and strategy for breathing less in a specific way that would bronchodilate, that would bring more air in to my body with CO2. So that's part of the physiology. You asked about the physiology. I wanted to give that background to why I care about the physiology. Well, it really is practical, not only in these acute situations, but we've started to see that low CO2 levels that weirdly, I was just doing all this research. I just I emailed one of the big teachers in these kinds of breath practices. He was my instructor for Buteyko certification, and Patrick McEwen is his name. And I was just emailing him about something called anion gap. And anion gap, I won't go into the details or weeds of it, but I'll just say that it's a metabolic problem, and CO2 is involved. Carbon dioxide is so important for many physiological functions, including the metabolism, blood sugar regulation, cardiovascular health, as well as asthma and allergies, chronic cough, respiratory infections, and even we know things like tonsil issues and certain ear problems are more likely to occur with breathing dysfunction, low CO2. And we have sleeping issues like bedwetting as well. And we have, you mentioned sleeping issues for your child as well. And we have even jaw problems from breathing dysfunction that lead to crooked teeth, lead to more dental problems, narrowing of the airway, risk for sleep apnea, respiratory disorders of all sorts. So carbon dioxide is directly related to this breathing technique and is directly related to what I would say is the underpinnings of a lot of problems in children and adults today.
Yeah, no, look, it sounds like you've got you just kept going with that list and this and list. So like for the listeners, let's tie that to ADHD. And I know you mentioned sleep apnea, and one of the things that often get missed in the diagnosis with ADHD is that underlying issue of sleep apnea. So can you just sort of like talk about how sort of this Buteyko breathing could help with symptoms of ADHD?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot about how the brain receives oxygen. Mm-hmm. So there's complex physiology. I'll mention what it is to you, but you don't need to understand it. Yeah. It's something called Bohr effect, and the Bohr effect is where in order to deliver oxygen to tissues, CO2 is required. And if CO2 is too low, the oxygen delivery to tissue is lower. Now, this is weird because when you breathe faster, you breathe more oxygen in, and people think, oh, I'm going to oxygenate tissue better. But the faster you breathe, the lower carbon dioxide gets. And if carbon dioxide gets lower, you have worse delivery of that oxygen into tissue. So for me, if I'm breathing quickly, I have a pulse ox on where I can look at my blood oxygen level. I'll see it going up, going up, going up. However, I'll get symptoms of oxygen deprivation in the brain. I'll start to get a little dizzy, a little lightheaded, and then I'll hold my breath. And when I hold my breath, I'll start to feel like that oxygen is getting delivered into the brain tissue. And we do know from studies that you can actually induce hypoxia or low oxygen from overbreathing. And that's interesting because you would think that you would get more oxygen that way, and you do into the blood, but you don't into tissue. And it's this balance, it's this incredible balance that we need in order to get that oxygen enough in the blood, but also enough in the tissue. And unfortunately, the issue is that most children and adults today actually are breathing such that there's a little bit low of that CO2, meaning oxygenation to the brain actually is low. We know from sleep apnea that can worsen the situation. Sleep apnea can lead to lower tissue oxygenation in the brain as well. And that hypoxia can contribute to many hormonal and cognitive changes that are problematic. So that's one of the mechanisms by which there's also nervous system mechanisms. And we do that blood flow in the brain changes when the nervous system activates into more sympathetic versus more parasympathetic. A new polyvagal theory talking even about two branches of the vagus involving a social nervous system even. And we know that heart rate variability is a measure that we can use to get a sense for the activation of that, what we call the sympathetic nervous system.
So just explain to listeners, that don't understand that sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic, just quickly as what that actually means.
So the very common explanation that's overly simplified is the sympathetic is fight and flight, and the parasympathetic is rest and digest. Now, when we advance our understanding into polyvagal theory, we know there are myelinated and unmyelinated branches of the vagus nerve, and it adds a third called the social nervous system. And the social nervous system really is that bonding, that capacity to feel safe and trusting enough to bond and connect with other people. And that translates to internal dialogue, being able to calm and soothe yourself as you get older and are an adult. And when you're younger, it's about healthy attachment, and it's about being able to bond with a parental figure or with friends. And that really makes a big difference in whether someone is going into a mode of fighting and flighting where the blood flow does go more out to the extremities, into the arms, into the legs, preparing to run or to fight. And the blood flow in the brain changes as well. And it shifts, and it is often because if you're preparing to fight or run away, your attention is a little distracted.
Yes.
Looking for the threats. You're looking for the threats. Where are the threats? Whereas when you're in this more parasympathetic mode, you're really more relaxed and able to focus. And so when it comes to ADHD and that focus, the nervous system is incredibly important. And this chronic sympathetic activation can be problematic. Now, there's a freeze response too. There's paralysis. There's a lot more to this picture than we need to get into here. But just the basics are, if someone's in that fight or flight, sympathetic activated, even if they don't feel stressed, often they'll be just scanning for subtle threat, even at the subconscious level. And if that's the feeling tone you're getting from your child or from yourself, then even if you don't feel acutely stressed, even if you have no reason to be stressed, the physiology may be in that stress response. And we can see a shift through breathing changes.
Okay, let's dive into those specifics of those breathing changes. I want to like sort of dive into sort of like the basics of it, the simple sort of Buteyko breathing exercise that parents can initiate. Then I probably want to look at what are those improvements they can see. But let's just give them an example of what that actually looks like or sounds like. We've got some people that are listening, we've got some people that are viewing. So let's sort of just, what is it like really? What is it in simple terms?
So in simple terms, we want to reduce the minute volume of air into the lung. So what's that mean? What's the minute volume of air? The minute volume of air is in 1 minute, how much volume of air comes into and leaves the lungs. So you can increase the minute volume of air in 2 ways. You can breathe faster, you can breathe deeper. You can decrease the minute volume in 2 ways. You can breathe less and you can breathe more slowly. Now, there is an important third dimension to this, which is shallow versus deep breathing and some misconceptions about that. So just quickly, I'll say that you can breathe into the abdomen with the diaphragm without breathing a lot of air. So we can say breathing deep can be breathing a lot of air, or we can say breathing deeply can be breathing into the deeper part of the lung by bringing the diaphragm down. Belly breathing, abdominal breathing, diaphragmatic breathing are terms people may have heard. The confusion is a lot of people think when they're belly breathing or diaphragmatic breathing, they have to breathe a lot of air volume. You can actually breathe very lightly, but deeply. You can breathe light, deep, and slow. So light, slow, deep breathing is a very basic technique that will help to be able to increase the amount of CO2 or carbon dioxide that has been associated with that bronchodilation we've been talking about by increasing nitric oxide that's associated with that nervous system shift. Because we do increase heart rate variability, and heart rate variability increases a sign of that nervous system shifting into that relaxed state, that state of safety. And by doing light, slow, deep, but not deep as in a lot of air, deep as in into the belly, into the diaphragm, we actually see that we get better gas exchange, we get more bronchodilation, and we'll feel like the airways are clearing. This is one of the symptoms, and I say symptom as a positive in this case, of doing this correctly is the nose unblocks. Does anyone kids have stuffy noses?
Yeah,
right?
and totally. Like there's, we have a lot of families that come that the kids have, it seems they've got stuffy noses or when they go to sleep at night. But I just want to, before we sort of dive into that, as a parent, I know people would think to themselves, is this type of breath work safe for children? Is it okay? Because it kind of goes against what we all know, isn't it? It's kind of like, deep breathing. And, I love how you explained it, because when I think of deep breathing, I think of like long, deep, slow breaths. And so is this safe for children?
Not only is it safe for children, there's actual data that's been collected that's shown improvements on things like asthma for children. It's actually I consider it very safe. Now, of course, you can push it, anything you can push to the extreme. You can breathe too lightly, too slowly. It's kind of hard to do because the body naturally kind of goes in the other direction. But so you have to kind of push. I mean, I've seen people who push so hard, maybe they pass out. I mean, that's really, really, really rare, right?
Really?
So, yes, you can overdo it. Yes, this could be unsafe, but it's very difficult for it to be unsafe. And I'll just say there are people who are pushing this to the extreme where it might be borderline unsafe, but they're doing it in the context of a professional environment. So in Poland, there's a woman. And I was in Poland talking to a man, his child it was disheartening. She had a stroke, just very, very young. She lost a lot of movement. And she, started to work with this woman. And this woman pushes her. Now, this little girl, she's just, red in the face afterwards, laying down, tired, sweaty because they're combining movement and breath holds. And that does start to become a little bit on the edge. So I wouldn't advise anyone do that outside of professional guidance, but I will say under professional guidance for stroke rehabilitation, for children who have had too low of oxygen to the brain for too long for whatever reason, be it in a birth issue, be it in an issue that happened in childhood, we do see the capacity to regain function in an incredible way. And so it is safe to do what we're talking about, these basic techniques for children. And it's even potentially beneficial to go more extreme under professional guidance. But of course, natural, don't push too hard. What I say is, if you're developing air hunger and this is the way I explain it to children is if you have air hunger, you feel like you want more air, but you feel it's okay, then keep going. If you feel like you want more air and you're feeling like it's not okay, or it's not going to be okay, take a breath. Don't try and push it too much. But what we do want is we want you to feel like you want a little more air, but you're okay. And if you want a little more air and you feel okay, then keep going. And that's the general rule of thumb to keep this safe.
Okay, so with that in mind, can you just guide us through sort of a simple Buteyko breathing exercise now, taking into consideration we do have some listening and some viewing?
Yeah. And I'll just make a quick aside. The children are often better at this than adults.
Yes, totally.
It's outdo you.
Yes.
So let's do a light, slow, deep breathing technique. And this is a very, very basic technique. What I want you to do is I want you to breathe normally. So sitting or laying down, breathing normally through your nose, not through your mouth. And take several breaths normal. Don't try to make them deep. Don't try to make them light right now. Just breathe. What's your baseline? What's your normal? What I'm going to do is, in a moment, I'll instruct us to begin the technique. And the technique will be to go about 90% of normal in terms of the rate and speed. So the inhale will be 10% slower than normal. The exhale will be 10% slower than normal. And while you're breathing deep into the diaphragm, the amount of air that you're taking in is 10% less than normal. So about 90% of the amount of air that you would normally be taking in, and about 90% of the speed that you would normally be breathing at. So what that looks like is, if normally it would be 5 seconds on an inhale, you're going down by 10%. And if normally you'd breathe in, let's say, a half of the volume of your lungs, you'd breathe in only just 10% less than a half of the volume of your lungs, but you are breathing deeply into the diaphragm. So go ahead and begin that now. And as you begin that now, the inhale in is through the nose still, inhaling about 90% of the speed, 90% of the normal amount. And as you exhale, exhaling a little slower, 10% slower. And then as you finish the exhale, gentle pause until you feel the urge to breathe again. And then gentle inhale, about 90%. Gentle exhale, about 90%, not of your capacity, but of what you normally breathe. Brief pause. And then inhaling again. Continue to do this. And as you're doing this, and of course, if anyone's driving or in an unsafe environment, please only do this if you're focused and in a safe place. As you do this, slowly continue to do this breathing, and notice if you're feeling a little bit of air hunger, a little bit of I'd like more air. If you are, that's good, as long as you feel like you're not stressed about it. Oh, I need a little more air. I want a little more air, but I'm not stressed about it. I feel okay. ride that. We want to, there's a space between, I feel like I could use more air and I'm freaking out because I need more air. If you're getting close to freaking out because you need more air, breathe a little more deeply and a little faster. If you're feeling like you're a little bit air hungry and you're okay, continue to go. The goal here is to feel this tolerable air hunger where you're still calm. If you start to notice your heart rate's increasing, that's a sign to go back a little bit, back off a little bit. And a couple more breaths like this, and then we'll pause. And I'll ask you to do a body scan. And the body scan is to see, do you notice a shift? And what is that shift? Do you feel more relaxed? Do you feel more stressed? Do you feel more aware? Do you feel more tired? Do you feel more alert? Do you feel your breathing, your sinuses have opened? Have they closed a little? We'll do a little body scan here. So go ahead and restore normal breathing and pay attention. There's no right or wrong, good or bad about the way that your body feels in response to this. This is learning right now because this is your first time. If it is your first time, if you're not already experienced, this is learning a little bit about what does this do? What does this do to my physiology? For some, if some who don't know and pushed a little too hard, maybe you do feel heart rate went up a little bit. Maybe you do feel you were a little bit anxious about needing that air. And that's good information to next time go a little light or don't go quite as far. And if you're feeling more relaxed and you're feeling more open in the sinuses, that's good information that you were doing really nicely. If you don't feel any change whatsoever, that's information that maybe you can push it a little harder next time. Maybe you can challenge yourself a little more next time and reduce the breathing even more because you didn't notice anything. So we may not have gotten a significant rise in CO2. And for you, maybe you can actually go a little more and rise your CO2 a little more.
Thank you for sharing that. The things that I was noticing was that when I was trying to breathe deeply and less, like, the inhale, 10% less, I was actually breathing faster. And I just really struggled with breathing less and going slower. It was the going slower that I struggled with. But as I'm sure with anything, the more you do it, the more, the more you practice, the more consistent you are, the better you get at it. And so for parents out there that are interested in introducing this to their children, how would you just suggest doing for that length of time? And then, what sort of practice would you suggest doing for them?
So first, I want to comment just on that when you know the underlying mechanism that we're trying to lower the minute volume of air in the lungs, you can start to play a little bit for yourself and what feels good. In other words, for you, maybe, based on what you're saying, maybe rather than taking in a little less air, maybe you slow by 20% and take in the same amount of air. Or there are other, so you could fill the whole lung if you breathe slow enough and still have a lesser minute volume of air than breathing. So what we know is that for most people, between 5 to maybe 8 breaths per minute for most people is going to be a rate in which we see the heart rate variability changes. Now, of course, that does depend on how much of the lung is filled, because you could breathe 8 times per minute and filling the lungs hugely every time and still actually get a higher minute volume of air through the lungs. But know that I'm saying 90% as a starting point, but because you know what I mean by lowering minute volume of air, maybe it's easier for some to go even slower with the same amount of air, and that will still work. And maybe for others, they can reduce the air, but the going slower is harder, and they can maybe reduce the air a little more and go as slow. So know that you have some flexibility there. For children, as a starting point, it's great to make it into a game. It's great to make it into a game and to do it together. And to do it together sometimes means you're tuning your attention to your child more than you are yourself, and you're adjusting your breathing to what you can look and see in them is starting to get that feeling of air hunger. So what I'll do with children often is I'll talk about how we're going to play a game, and we're going to see how much you can slow your breath while you still feel like you're not needing too much air. And with children, I really like to combine it with walking often, but you can start without combining it with walking. It does get a little more challenging when combining it with walking. The first step, though, is through the nose. If the child is breathing through their mouth, the first step is through the nose, through the nose, through the nose, without even trying to modify the minute volume of air. First is get nose breathing. And so sometimes it's a little game of, you put your hand here or pinch your lips and let's breathe together. There is mouth tape too that's made for children that doesn't cover here, doesn't cover doesn't go over the lips, it goes around the lip.
Okay.
And by going the lips, it encourages a little bit of tension there, a little bit of tension. And they make some of those with fun, like animals and fun, it looks like a sticker that's a fun sticker and they can put on. And sometimes just putting on some mouth tape and walking together can be helpful in training nose breathing if nose breathing isn't already happening. If nose breathing is already happening, then we can do a game of counting. Sometimes helps. Let's try inhale for 5, exhale for 5, and hold for 3. Inhale for 5, exhale for 5, hold
I like
for
that.
4. Inhale for 5, exhale for 5, hold for 5. Tell me if you're getting too uncomfortable. Let's see how high we can get.
So so what I'm hearing, so in the hold part, are you trying to increase the hold part as you learn this? So I know you said, reduce by 90%, reduce by 90%. And then as you go, do you want to increase the hold?
Well, again, it's about the minute volume of air in the lungs. By holding on the exhale is another way, aside from changing the rate, the speed of the inhale, the speed of the exhale, the depth. You can also just hold. Obviously, that's going to reduce.
Okay, so that's the key here. The minute volume of air. And so if we bring it back to that, I think that if you really, just understand that concept, then this can be quite an easy way to think about it, rather than I was really struggling with the slowing it down, and but when we bring it back to that, it definitely makes sense. Now, Miles, how soon might children with ADHD and parents sort of begin to observe positive changes from consistent Buteyko breathing practices?
Certain things happen right away. And I'll just say that the hold on the breath I recommend after the exhale, not the inhale, just because you can get dizzy if you're holding on the inhale. So if you're going to use a hold, use it on the exhale, and that will stronger build up that CO2 level. So some benefits come very quickly. We do see sometimes, even in the first session, the nose starts to clear if there's a stuffy nose, or even if there's not a stuffy nose. Sometimes most people, they breathe better out of one nostril than the other. You can even play with this as a game. You can say, okay, plug this nostril. How are you? How breathe? How much air is that plugged? Is that normal? and then this nostril. Like, oh, is that one easier than the other one? And then let's do this together. And then let's try again. And oh, this one's easier now. How about that? So that sometimes is interesting to play with. The other things that people sometimes will notice right away are if they have cold hands, cold feet, those can get warm because we do see that circulation can improve. So we may see that cold hands, cold feet start to warm, or even if the hands and the feet don't feel too cold, that they start to get a little bit warm. The sinuses maybe are thinning the mucus and draining, so maybe swallowing. If you notice your child or yourself swallowing more, that would be one thing that you would know. Okay, we're on the right track. We're doing this well. And sometimes that relaxation, if there is anxiety, if there is stress, if there is this sense of being hyperactive, we might see a reduction in that hyper activity, and that would be a sign. And those can happen sometimes just immediately on the first session. Now, they may not last very long. And that's where we want to train the natural and default breathing to. So I'm going to take one step back and I'm going to say there are chemoreceptors in the brain, and these chemoreceptors in the brain sense CO2 levels, carbon dioxide levels. And it is not a lack of oxygen that tells your brain to breathe. It is the chemosensitivity to the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood that tells your brain tells your body to breathe. And the brain is telling the body to breathe. These chemoreceptors become hypersensitive to CO2 with asthma, with many chronic diseases, with many problems that are related to hyperactivity and stress. The brain becomes hypersensitive. These chemoreceptors will tell the body to breathe before the CO2 levels reach the point at which they would optimally benefit the nervous system, the blood flow, the cardiovascular system. So we need to train. We train the brain and to tolerate more CO2. We increase what we call CO2 tolerance. So these chemoreceptors become more tolerant to a higher base level of CO2. To get that base level higher, when that base level gets higher, you just naturally breathe slower. You don't even have to think about it because the brain is trained. So we sometimes call this breath retraining. And sometimes as little as 4 to 6 weeks is enough to really retrain the brain for the base level of breathing. Not that you don't benefit from continued practice after that, you do. But the big part of the global benefit comes when the brain is retrained, and 4 to 6 weeks is often enough to see the brain retrained. And then we see more of these lasting effects. So not just for while you're doing the breathing, your nose gets clearer and then it gets stuffy 5 minutes later because the breathing changed.
Yeah.
But the brain has been trained, the chemoreceptor sensitivity has shifted, and then we see actually that there's less stuffy noses across the board, and there's better breathing responses and less asthma across the board, and there's less hyperactivity and more relaxed across the board, better sleep every night. So that's where we get to with some diligent training over 4 to 6 weeks. And for some people, maybe 12 weeks. It depends how much dysfunction. Within 1 to 3 months, typically we're seeing significant shifts if there's regular training in those 1 to 3 months.
Fascinating. And who would have thought that you can retrain your brain how to breathe? And I think that that's a perfect point to wrap up today's chat about Buteyko breathing with Dr. Michael Nichols. Michael, why did I say Michael? I know it's Miles, but I just said Michael. Can call you Michael, can't we? I want to thank you just for diving deep. And just as last time when you spoke, you are one intelligent fella and you know a lot about these techniques and, disease. And what you're doing is changing the face of how we handle these chronic diseases. And I think it is amazing. It's amazing, to dive deep, especially like into this world of breath work, and its benefits for our kiddos. I know it might seem complicated, but really at the end of the day, breathing is so innate to everything that we do. And if you can train your brain or retrain your brain, it will be amazing to see how these can have such a big impact, not only on our kiddos with ADHD, but on asthma, on, stuffy noses, on chronic disease. Miles, please tell listeners where they can find and follow you online.
Yeah. And before I do, I just want to say thank you for paying attention to this and being open-minded to the possibility that some of the breath information that's out there, unfortunately, some of it might actually be harmful or contrary to what we find to be effective. But do your own research, look at the clinical trials. If you need to, look at the Buteyko Clinic, the ButeykoBreathing.org. They have information about children. They cite papers. So please do look at that information if you're wanting to learn more and getting a good instructor. But there are also YouTube videos and an app for the phone and lots of resources.
Awesome.
And for children walking, I'll just say walking. Sometimes if you're having trouble with the sitting down exercises, really try the walking exercises and doing some of this while walking. The kids love that and they're really good at it too. And so, they can sometimes walk while holding their breath for a lot of steps. You can say walk across the room and they're holding their breath the whole time. So wow, really amazing. And so just know that that's some additional little pearls. To find out more about me and my clinic, you can go to medicinewithheart.com. That's the best place because we have blog resources there. We have a lot of free resources where you can read information about breath work and functional medicine and even cutting edge innovative things like peptides and other interesting information there. And that has the resources for being able to contact the clinic if you're interested to find out more about working with the clinic. So that is a great resource for me. And then the Buteyko Clinic app and the ButeykoBreathing.org website are great resources for general Buteyko breathing information.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and your passion with all of our listeners. This was fascinating. And I'm going to be coming back to this podcast episode to practice my Buteyko breathing. Now, listeners, remember, just take it step by step and see how it goes. We love hearing from listeners. So be sure to leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform with your stories or any changes you notice. I'm sure Dr. Miles will be coming back and checking in to see that as well. It's always great to hear how you're doing. Also, don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with the latest from the Soaring Child podcast. Dr. Miles, again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you, everyone.
Listeners, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Soaring Child podcast. I'm Dana Kate, your ADHD health practitioner. Keep on thriving. Thank you for listening to the Soaring Child podcast today. To learn more about how to help your child with ADHD soar using natural strategies, visit our website at adhdthriveinstitute.com and follow us on social media at ADHD Thrive Institute.